Hey guys, this is Dave, and this is Audio in Reviews. I have the Dunu 142. Of course, this falls right below the 242. The 242 has a 2DD 4BA 2 microplanar driver setup. This has 1DD 4BA 2 microplanars, so one less dynamic driver, and it's also $100 less than the 242. The design is pretty similar to the 242. It's just blue instead of red. The accessories, the packaging is basically the same, but it does take a pretty different approach in terms of tuning from the 242. So we will talk more about that, but first, let's go over what's included in the box. We'll talk about the specifications, the design, and then we'll get into sound. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. So this is everything that comes in the box with the 142. Again, it's basically the same as the 242. You get a 2-pin modular cable with a 4.4 and 3.5 interchangeable termination. One of my absolute favorite Dunu cases, an excellent selection of ear tips as usual, a headphone adapter, a cleaning tool, and then 3 themed cards. And again, this is priced at $249. The 242 is $349. It also has one less dynamic driver than the 242, so 1 DD instead of 2 BAs, and then 2 microplanar drivers. The shell is 3D printed, and it is a little bit on the larger side. The nozzle is also a little big. It did take some work when I was trying to get the tips on. They are comfortable though, so despite their size, I didn't really have any fit issues, but again, just be aware that the nozzles are a little large. The design of the faceplate is pretty cool. Again, similar to the 242, but it's blue instead of red. The overall finish of the faceplate and shell is very clean. Generally, the build quality is very, very good. The build quality of the cable is also very good. It uses high quality hardware. However, it is maybe a little bit on the stiff side. There are certainly softer cables out there. It is manageable. It also does a good job of avoiding tangles. It doesn't really have any issues with memory. And again, it's just generally a pretty manageable cable despite being a little bit stiff. And again, it is modular, which is nice. The case is also nice as well. It's one of my favorite Dunu cases. It is a little big, but that extra space means the IEMs will fit very nicely, and you'll have a little extra room for ear tips and the other termination. Generally, just a super solid package overall for this price point, which again is kind of what I've come to expect from Dunu. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to sound. So they've taken a pretty different tuning approach from the 242, and they've opted to lean a little closer to a U-shaped tuning as opposed to the neutral tuning of the 242. But I need to back up just a little bit. I do need to mention that like the 242, the 142 is also impedance sensitive. So if your source has a higher impedance output, what it does is it increases the bass and it decreases the treble. My recommendation is to try and stick with sources that have a lower impedance output. So 1 ohm or less. At least that's my recommendation. That's my preference. So with a low impedance source, the 142 has more of a U-shaped presentation because there's an emphasis on the extension in both directions, so the sub bass and the upper treble. And then the mid-range is a little bit recessed. So again, we're going from a more neutral tuning with a 242 to more of a U-shaped tuning with a 142. So the 142 has quite a bit more bass energy, and it also has a lot more upper mid energy than the 242. And you might also hear me comparing this with the Harrier occasionally because there are some similarities in the way they approached the tuning of the mids and the bass. Of course, the Harrier is what I would consider neutral with a bass boost, but with the 142, again, that adds even more of a sub bass boost and then increases the upper treble energy. That's why I think the 142 leans more U-shaped than the Harrier. In any case, in terms of bass energy, it's definitely boosted. And the way they tuned the bass is, again, it's more sub bass focused. So you have more sub bass energy than mid bass energy, which means the emphasis is focused more on sub bass rumble and less on the mid bass impact or punch. It's there. You do have some mid bass punch, but it takes a little bit of a backseat to the sub bass. And they started the bass rise out of the low mids into the mid bass pretty late. Again, very similar to what we saw with the Harrier, but with even more bass. So they started the bass rise out of the mids below around 200 hertz, which that does a couple of things. First, it gives you better bass separation, so you're less likely to run into issues with bass bleed in the mid-range and maintain a nice, clean mid-range presentation. But at the same time, it can tame or reduce kick impact, and it can also cause vocals and instruments to sound maybe a little thin and lack weight. But I don't think that's the case here. Of course, this will all come down to preference, but to me, I do still think the 142 avoids sounding overly thin. And in my opinion, vocals and instruments still have good note weight. They still have enough body to keep them from sounding too light or thin. And I also feel like they did a pretty good job of keeping things sounding natural. And that's more important to me. Of course, this is where the upper mids start to come into play, and they have increased that upper mid-range energy quite a bit over the 242. So vocals are going to be pushed more forward than the 242, which, considering the amount of bass energy the 142 has, I do feel like that extra upper mid energy is kind of necessary to balance that bass energy out. And it does do that. This is a very balanced set overall, in my opinion. But because of that extra upper mid-range energy, you're also going to have good vocal clarity and good vocal focus, and again, also good vocal naturalness. Now, whether or not it has enough warmth in its vocal and instrument presentation, again, that's going to come down to your preference, your taste. I do feel confident in saying it does sound natural. It doesn't sound unnatural in any way to my ears. Treble energy is good overall. There is quite a bit of upper treble energy. I would even say it's an upper treble focused presentation. That's going to, of course, bring a lot of air, a lot of shimmer to its presentation, but at the same time, it can at times come across maybe as a little bright. So depending on your tuning preference and whether or not you have any kind of sensitivity to treble, it could possibly come across as too energetic for some, and maybe even get to the point of becoming fatiguing. I don't know that it ever reached that point for me. However, there were maybe a couple of times I did find myself reaching for the volume knob just to dial things back a little bit. So again, just something to bear in mind if you are considering this set. I do think, generally speaking, that it was able to reproduce cymbals pretty naturally. Now, as far as technical performance, it's actually pretty impressive in terms of overall detail levels. Staging and layering is also good for this price point. It's definitely up there with some of the best. I would say it's probably about on par with the Harrier and the Volume S, landing maybe just below the Pilgrim, again, in terms of overall technical performance, which is pretty impressive at this price point. Now, as far as comparisons, we'll start with the 242. Again, the 242 takes more of a neutral approach. It has less bass energy, more upper mid-range energy, and less treble energy than the 142. So the 242 is more suited, I think, for vocal lovers, whereas the 142 does have a decent vocal energy and clarity for this tuning approach, but it's going to offer more fun, and its overall presentation, I think, is just going to be more engaging, having that extra bass and treble energy. Now, as far as comparisons with IEMs within this price range, because this is a little more expensive, compared with the Koto Ito. The Koto Ito has more bass energy, of course, overall. Much of that energy is focused more on the mid bass, so it's warmer, it has more kick impact. Upper mid-range energy is maybe about the same as the 142 as far as its overall energy, but there is a little more energy. There's a peak around 3K, which does change or affect the vocal presentation of the Koto Ito a little bit. But then the 142 has a little more treble energy. Both are great sets, but the Koto Ito is a little funner, a little more engaging. However, the 142 is a fun set as well. It does bring a little more in the way of technical performance. So it's really going to come down to your bass and treble level preference. I do think the 142 might be a better all-arounder compared with the 5+2. The 5+2 is definitely more relaxed in its bass and upper mid-range energy. It does have more warmth and richness in the lower mids. The upper mids and treble are more relaxed as well. It still has maybe sort of a mild V-shaped presentation. The 142 is going to be funner, more engaging, because it does still have more sub-bass energy. Then again, with that added upper mid and treble energy, it has just a more engaging and more energetic presentation overall. So as far as who I would recommend the 142 to, this is going to be for those looking for an engaging and funner presentation that does not sacrifice overall naturalness. Again, it has more of a U-shaped signature, the extra energy being focused in the sub-bass on the extension in both directions, sub-bass and upper treble, and there isn't as much energy in the mid-bass like you might find in some V-shaped sets. So it's not going to have, again, it's not going to have as much kick impact, and for some it might lack a little bit in terms of overall warmth and richness. I don't think it ever really gets to the point of sounding overly thin, but I will say when you compare it with sets like the 5+2, you will notice that there is less lower mid and mid bass present. Again, it's going to come down to your preference. I do think that the 142, however, is still a very good all-arounder in general, and that a lot of you will find this tuning very, very pleasing. Overall, again, I think it's a very, very solid set for this price point. In any case, I think that does it for this review. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch. If you like my content, please take a second and hit that subscribe button. Also, if you would please like this video, please share this video, please comment on this video. I hope you guys have an awesome day.